Our last presentation, so that we have a little time for questions, is from Ms. Aisha Khan, Chief Executive Officer, Mountain and Glacier Protection Organization and the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change, Islamabad, the Disorderly New Order. 20 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here in such a distinguished gathering. Thank you, Dr. Masuma, for your invitation and giving me the opportunity to speak from your prestigious platform. I work in the climate space as a practitioner and as a policy advocate. So what I'm going to do is use climate as my pivot and build my argument around why we should move towards regional integration. So while they do that, I think I will start by saying that we're living perhaps through one of the most turbulent and uncertain periods in modern human history. The world is standing at a crossroads with convergence of climate crisis, armed conflict, soaring inflation, and escalating debt burdens on developing countries. The new emerging order will have chaos as its centerpiece, and it will severely test democracy and all the right-based values that are associated with it. What we're likely to see is a realignment of geopolitical alliances and greater focus on geo-economic partnerships in political decision-making. We will have to find order within this disorder. With every passing year, we are moving one step closer to locking in tipping points and compromising the threshold of our safety and our security. What we need to bear in mind are the factors that will play a role in crashing through the 1.5 guardrails, and think about what we need to do to bring a shift in policies, perspectives, and politics that are needed to brace for the change that we're going to face. This is going to be a very, very critical period in our history, because we are going to face climate and conflict immediately as we approach the next decade. Climate and conflict is at the heart of this crisis. As we move forward and as we face scarcities, what we are likely to see is reduction in production and increase in demand. So we'll see a burgeoning population and we will have less to meet the needs of the people. This will result in out-migrations, this will result in displacements, and this will contribute to societal tensions leading us towards conflict. We already live in a neighborhood that is highly disputed. So any disruption in flow of goods and services here will increase the pressure and demands on us to cope with the problem. I think for any country, it is very important to look at its coping capacity through the lens of its national circumstance. And we happen to live in a geography that stretches from the cryosphere to the coastline, with fertile plains and arid and semi-arid areas in between. So within this, we need to look at the sectors that are going to be very important for Pakistan. Food, water, energy are the three sectors on which we typically focus. When we look at the water sector, the first thing that we need to remember is that our source of water is transboundary. I know much has been said about water before, but I want to remind the audience that 40% of the water that flows in the Indus gets its intake from the upper catchments from snow and glacier melt that makes it highly vulnerable to changes in climate change. So far, the intake of water, the 138 million acre feet or 140, has not changed. But the per capita has gone down from 5,000 cubic meters to 960, and it's going to shrink even more. What's more important to remember also is that 91% of this water is used for irrigation. So if there's any change in these flows, in the timing, in the amplitude, we are going to have a crisis. And that is why we say that water is the number one security problem that we face in Pakistan. We are an agrarian economy, but over 40% of our people are food insecure right now, and about 18% are highly insecure, severely insecure. Our crop yields are 15 to 20% below the global average, and Dr. Ikrar has given you some of the reasons and rationale for that. We are also amongst the lowest 10 countries in the world in terms of our water productivity. 4 crops use almost 80% of our water, and they give us 4 to 5% of GDP values. Energy is the largest single drain on our economy. We are signatory to the Paris Agreement, and we have committed to switch to renewables, but we require 101 billion to make that transition, money that is not available to us. We have the solar, wind, hydro potential, but we do not have the resources, we do not have the technology, and we do not have the capacity to move in that direction. Disasters are going to remain a recurrent theme with us. We've experienced disasters, the super floods of 2010, and then 11, and then 12, and then 2022 was the biggest eye-opener. This tells us that we need large amounts of investment in developing our adaptive capacity and resilience to disasters. Otherwise, this one-time shock that we got of the 30 million, our economy has been pushed back. And if we continue along this line in a very pessimistic scenario, perhaps we are going to face 10 to 13% losses in our GDP, and we are also going to see an increase in rural poverty, whereas 50% of our communities live in rural areas. This is going to have a terrible impact on us. This becomes an explosive mix for us because if we do not handle this with care and caution, and what I'm referring to is food, water, energy, and disasters, we are going to have a very big crisis on our hands. So we need to move ahead very cautiously with one eye on the pulse of the nation and the other on regional and global trends, developments, and the emerging threats. Every year when it's time to go to the annual climate conference, we start talking about climate justice. Now, there's no question that the global north is responsible for the historical emissions. We see that they have 80% of the global wealth, they have 20% of the population, and they're responsible for 90% of the excess in emissions since 1850. But does that mean that we're going to get that justice? I have been going to these COPs over 10 years now, and what I see is a similar pattern. There is a reluctance to agree to the responsibility. We talk about common but differentiated responsibilities, but in reality, nobody is willing to come forward and give you the money that you need. At the last conference of parties, it was a global stocktake, which means Paris was revisited to see how far countries have come in to meet their commitments. It was a great thing that the Loss and Damage Fund was established, but when you look at the seed money that's available in it, about 800 million, it's nothing compared to the need, which hovers anything between 5 to 8 trillion. So civil society demand is to create at least a floor of 400 million per annum till 2030. When we look at the Green Climate Fund pledges, we again see that there's only about 12.5 billion, whereas the demand is for 1 trillion annually. So this gap is going to come at a heavy cost to Pakistan. When you look at the needs of Pakistan, it needs a huge amount, 348 billion by 2030. It has the possibility of 39 billion from public finance and about 9 billion from private finance. So that gap of 30 million is a huge problem for us, for which we need to work very hard to make other arrangements, other alternative cash flows, and other pathways to generate revenue. We cannot rely on the GCF. We cannot rely on external finance as the only source of coping with our problem, because climate change is happening. It's already here. From slow onset to extreme events, it is there. It is going to take its toll on us. So the next best thing that we can do is to try and see how can we strengthen our resilience. Some of the key takeaways that I saw at this stock take, because this was a stock take, so after 28 years of conference of parties, you come to certain conclusions and you see certain trends and patterns that are taking place. So it's quite obvious that we are all set to breach the 1.5 degrees. We also see that amongst the developing countries, the like-minded, the G77 group plus China, there's growing dissatisfaction with the multilateral system because it is not delivering. We also see that within countries, societal tensions are mounting, and the global financial system is not fit for purpose. The geopolitical landscape is changing, and we see an uptick on the right-wing politics taking place in erosion of democratic norms. I'll come to South Asia now because the future of South Asia and its capacity to absorb will have a direct impact on how we face this crisis. Now, South Asia is a large landmass. That's why it's a subcontinent. It has about 2 billion people that reside here. But when we look at the demographics, we see that it's nearly 50% men and women. There's a high percentage of poverty here. But what's more, I think, alarming is that the demographic bulge is towards the youth. Now, the youth can be both a bane or a boon depending on how you channel that energy. We also need to see something that people mostly overlook, that there's a very high rate of stunting all over South Asia, which means that the youth that is going to be in the leadership position perhaps may not have the cognitive abilities that are necessary for decision making. So I think agriculture and fisheries constitute a major portion of livelihood and employment in South Asia, and both are going to get affected severely by climate change. So all this is going to create turmoil in society, and if South Asian nations don't learn how to work together with each other, it's going to create problems. We are, for some unfortunate reasons, the least integrated region in the world. And what happens in one country in South Asia is not going to remain confined to that country. We are connected by land, by water, and by air. And the Generation Z is going to be very important. Globally, it's about 2 billion, and in South Asia, the young outnumber the old. If you look at South Asia's past decade, couple of decades, you'll also see that the percentage of disasters has been increasing. We have about 750 million people who were affected in the past decade. We have another 800 million in South Asia that are living in climate hotspots where it will become so hot that people will be forced to outmigrate. Where will these people go? How will the host communities accommodate them? What will be the societal tensions that will get triggered? It's a whole negative feedback loop that will be put in motion and spiral out of control. In just over 2 decades, we see that disasters alone have taken damages toll worth almost 150 billion. This is not a future that we can afford. South Asia definitely needs to revisit its past. It needs to review its current pathway, and it needs to plan for a resilient future. How the countries and its leadership and its people plan to do that depends largely on how they change their thinking, their narrative, and their hopes and aspirations for a different kind of future. I just want to talk very briefly about the cryosphere over here. Our frozen assets in the Himalaya, Karakoram, and Hindu Kush mountains that make up the largest cryospheric space outside the North and South Pole are melting. But thaw is taking place in the wrong place. We need to switch roles and bring a thaw in relationships that allows for ideas to flow and for conversations to begin and how to save our slow. Because this is where the problem begins. Water, if we recognize that as the most important crisis that we are facing, begins here. It's frozen, it melts. Its timing, its amplitude, its flows make a difference. It supports the lives of about 180 million people directly and about 180 billion people indirectly. So what happens in our cryosphere is very important. This is also an area which I, as a civil society and a climate practitioner, advocate as an entry point for cooperation, because if we can have coordinated research, if we can better understand what is happening in the upper regions from where we get our water, perhaps we will be able to move forward and move towards cooperation. I think there was a lot of conversation, the keynote by Ambassador Jilani, and then the conversation followed by Ambassador Javed Hussain on South Asia and the challenges that we face. So I do understand that it is very difficult to deconstruct a paradigm that you have built and a narrative that you have shared with your people over the last 7 decades, because it is embedded in the psyche now. So we take a very emotive stance towards issue rather than take a realistic or a more rational approach. But I think what we need to do is to understand that Pakistan is a part of South Asia. We cannot change our geography. Every country in South Asia is an upper or lower riparian state. And if we share water from the same source, we need to be concerned about water, its scarcity, its availability, and how we are going to collaborate, cooperate to use this scarce resource, this shrinking resource, this uncertain resource in future to take care of the needs of 2 billion people. Pakistan definitely needs to have a dialogue, a national dialogue, because if you want to shift your narrative or revisit a narrative that you have followed for very long, it's very important to have a national dialogue. And in that dialogue, I think one thing that we do not do is to have a very clear articulation, a very transparent discussion on the cost of business as usual and what could be the benefits of cooperation, and then let the people decide what kind of future do they want to choose for themselves. Because if this consensus is not developed on what kind of narrative change we want, I think it will make it very difficult for us to move in a future in which things are changing very dynamically. So Pakistan has to choose its position. Pakistan has to recognize the fragility and crisis that it has to cope with. It has to also understand that it is carrying the burden of existing tensions, but there are new emerging threats. So there's need to prioritize over here to see which ones are the existential threats that you need to cope with immediately. Perhaps we need to decouple politics, and there was a question that was raised from the floor in this regard as well, that is it possible to decouple politics from other issues which can be of benefit to the two countries, and to move forward. And there was a comment, I think, to say also that the young people who are present in this room are very important, because it's really the new generation that has to come forward and decide what kind of future that they want, and then to take ownership for that future. So I'll just end on a note of hope, because my theme was about disorder and chaos. So I want to just end on a note of hope to say, most people say hope is not a plan, but I would say that hope is the best plan, as long as it is anchored in positivity and embedded in realism. Change is always possible. We just need to choose our destination and then plot a trajectory that will actually get us there. And let's make that place a place we'd like to visit. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Thank you so much.